how people slept through winter in the great stone castles of medieval Europe. These structures still stand today, cold and imposing. Walk into one on a winter afternoon and you will feel it immediately. The chill that lives in the walls, the air that never quite warms. For those who lived there, winter was not a brief inconvenience. It lasted months. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Snow piled against walls built 10 feet thick. Inside those walls, there was no central heating, no thermostats, no way to warm the vast spaces evenly. Yet people slept there. Families, servants, soldiers, children. They went to bed each night as the temperature fell, and they woke each morning when frost covered the tapestries. This is their story, not dramatic, not filled with crisis, simply the steady reality of sleeping in stone rooms through long winter nights, year after year, generation after generation. We will move slowly through one such night. We will see how they prepared, how they created small islands of warmth in the cold, how they endured. So settle in, let the story unfold at its own pace. The castle began with stone, blocks of limestone, granite, sandstone, quarried from nearby hills or brought by cart from miles away. Each block was cut, lifted, fitted into place. Walls rose slowly, 10 feet thick in some places, 12 feet, 20 feet where defence mattered most. Stone was chosen for a reason. It could not burn. Arrows did not penetrate it. Siege weapons battered against it, and the walls held. A wooden fortress could be set ablaze in an hour. A stone castle stood for centuries. But stone had another quality, one that mattered every winter night. It held cold, not just surface cold, the kind that fades when the sun comes out. Deep cold, the kind that sank into the material itself and stayed there. In summer, stone walls remained cool even when the air outside was warm. In winter, they became reservoirs of cold that no fire could fully counter. The thicker the wall, the more cold it held, and castle walls were thick by necessity. They had to withstand battering rams, undermine attempts, prolonged siege. So the very feature that made them safe also made them nearly impossible to heat. Medieval builders understood this. They were not surprised by it. Cold stone walls were the price of security. In a world where violence was common and sudden, where rival lords or invading forces might appear at any time, a structure that could be defended mattered more than one that could be kept warm. This was not ignorance, it was priority. The result was a building that functioned as a massive heat sink. During the day, if the sun shone and fires were lit, some warmth accumulated in the air, but the walls absorbed that warmth, pulling it away from the living spaces. At night, when fires were banked and the temperature outside dropped, the walls released their stored cold back into the rooms. You could stand near a wall and feel it. Not drafts, though those existed too. Just the steady radiation of cold from the stone itself. Your body heat flowed toward the wall and vanished into it. If you pressed your hand against the surface, the chill moved up your arm. In the great hall, where the ceiling might be 30 feet high, the cold settled in layers. Warm air from the central hearth rose and gathered uselessly near the roof beams. Cold air pooled at floor level where people walked and sat. The fire provided light and some heat, but it could not overcome the volume of cold stone surrounding it. Private chambers were no better. Smaller rooms should have been easier to heat, but they were still enclosed by stone. A single fireplace in a 20-foot square room fought a losing battle. The walls took the heat and held it. The floor, often stone as well, stayed cold beneath rushes or rugs. There were no insulated barriers, no double-pane windows, no weather stripping, just stone, thick and unrelenting, between the people inside and the winter outside. And because stone conducts temperature slowly, it never fully warmed and never fully released the cold. This was the environment. Not by accident or poor planning, but by design. The castle was built to protect life, even if living inside it required endurance. So when winter came, the stone remembered. It remembered every cold day, every freezing night. It held that memory in its mass and shared it with everyone who lived within. The first step in understanding how medieval people slept through winter is understanding this. The building itself was cold. Not just the air, but the structure. And there was no changing that. The design of a castle followed military logic. Walls needed to be high to prevent scaling. Windows needed to be narrow to prevent entry. Doorways needed to be few and defensible. Rooms needed clear sight lines for guards. Towers needed to overlook approaches from every direction. Comfort was secondary. The main hall, where most daily life occurred, was built tall. High ceilings allowed smoke from the central hearth to rise. They also allowed heat to escape upward, far from the people below. The hall needed to accommodate many people at once during feasts or assemblies, so it was vast. Vast spaces are difficult to heat evenly. Windows in the hall and in private chambers were small. Glass was expensive and rare in the early medieval period. Most windows were simply openings in the stone, sometimes with wooden shutters, sometimes with oiled cloth or animal membrane stretched across to let in light while blocking wind. But even shuttered windows leaked cold. The frames did not seal tightly. Gaps remained. Arrow slits, designed for defence, were everywhere. Narrow on the outside, wider on the inside, they allowed archers to shoot outwards while minimising their exposure to incoming fire. But they also allowed cold air to flow inward continuously. There was no way to close an arrow slit. It was a permanent opening to the outside. Doorways were built thick, with heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron. But doors were opened frequently. Servants moved between rooms carrying food, water, firewood, chamber pots. Each opening released warm air and admitted cold. Even when closed, doors did not seal perfectly. Cold seeped through the gaps around the frame. Spiral staircases, built into towers, connected different levels. These stairways were enclosed in stone shafts. They acted as chimneys for cold air. Drafts moved constantly up and down the stairs, pulling cold from lower levels to upper ones, or pushing it downward depending on temperature differences. Floors in most castles were stone or packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes. Rushes provided some insulation, but not much. Cold from the ground below or from unheated lower levels rose through the floor. People walking across a castle floor in winter felt it through their shoes, through the leather or fabric soles that were not designed for insulation. Ceilings in private chambers were lower than in the Great Hall, but still high by modern standards, 10 feet, 12 feet. This was partly for grandeur, partly for smoke ventilation if a fireplace was present. But heat rises. The warmest air in a room gathered above head height, where it did no good for someone lying in bed. The layout of a castle spread rooms along corridors and around courtyards. To move from one part of the structure to another meant passing through unheated transitional spaces. A person sleeping in a private chamber might be near a fireplace, but the corridor outside their door was not heated at all. Servants' quarters were often in less desirable locations, farther from heat sources, closer to exterior walls. Courtyards within the castle walls were open to the sky. In winter, snow accumulated there. The cold from these open spaces radiated inward, chilling the rooms that faced them. Some castles had multiple layers of walls. The outer curtain wall, the inner bailey, the keep. Each layer provided security, but it also meant more stone, more thermal mass, more cold held in reserve. Roofs were typically slate, tile, or thatch, depending on region and period. None of these materials provided significant insulation. Snow on the roof added weight, but did not warm the rooms below. In fact, the presence of snow indicated that so little heat escaped through the roof that it could not melt the snow above. Architects and builders of the time understood load-bearing principles, defensive angles, drainage for waste and rainwater. They knew how to construct vaults and arches that would support immense weight. They knew how to position a castle on high ground for visibility and defence. They did not know how to build a structure that retained heat efficiently while also meeting defensive requirements. The knowledge existed for smaller, warmer buildings. Peasant cottages with their low ceilings, small windows, and central hearths could be kept relatively warm, but a castle could not be built like a cottage and still function as a fortress. So the architecture created an environment where heat could not accumulate. Every feature that made the castle strong also made it cold, and the people who lived there adapted to that reality, not by redesigning the castle, but by changing how they slept. Fire was the only source of warmth. In the Great Hall, a fire burned in a central hearth. This was not a fireplace set into a wall, but an open fire built on a stone platform in the middle of the room. Smoke rose toward the ceiling, where it eventually found its way out through a louvre, a small opening in the roof. Sometimes it found that opening quickly. Often it did not. The central hearth was large. It needed to be. It provided light for the hall and heat for dozens of people who gathered there during the day. Logs were placed directly on the stone, often propped on iron dogs to allow air circulation beneath. The fire burned all day and into the evening, but the heat from this fire dispersed in all directions. It rose upward, where it was wasted. It radiated outward toward the stone walls, which absorbed it. Only those standing or sitting close to the fire felt real warmth. A person 10 feet away might see the light and smell the smoke, but feel little heat. At night, the fire was banked. This meant covering the burning coals with ash to slow combustion, preserving some heat until morning. A banked fire did not produce flames or significant warmth. It simply kept coals alive so they could be rekindled without starting from scratch. In private chambers, some rooms had fireplaces built into the walls. These were more efficient than central hearths, because they directed heat into the room rather than allowing it to dissipate in all directions. A chimney carried smoke upward and out through the wall or roof, reducing the amount of smoke that lingered in the room. But not every room had a fireplace. Fireplaces required skilled construction. The chimney had to draw properly, pulling smoke upward without allowing downdrafts to push it back into the room. This required understanding airflow, flue dimensions, and placement. Many early castles had few fireplaces. Later castles had more, but even then, only the most important chambers were equipped with them. A fireplace in a private chamber was a mark of status. The Lord and Lady's chamber would have one. Perhaps chambers for important guests. Rooms used by lesser members of the household often had no fireplace at all. Where there was no fireplace, people used braziers. A brazier was a metal container, often mounted on legs, that held burning coals. It could be moved from room to room as needed. The coals provided some heat and a small amount of light, but a brazier was also a fire hazard. It had to be watched carefully. It could not be placed too close to wooden furniture or fabric, and it produced smoke which had nowhere to go except into the room and eventually out through cracks and windows. Braziers were common in castles where fireplaces were scarce. They were practical but limited. The amount of heat a brazier could generate was small. It warmed the immediate area around it, perhaps a few feet. Beyond that, the cold prevailed. Fuel for fires came from the surrounding land. Wood was the primary source. Forests were managed for this purpose. Trees were cut, logs were split, and wood was hauled to the castle and stored. In regions where wood was scarce, people burned peat, which was cut from bogs, dried and stacked. Peat burned slower than wood and produced a different kind of heat, dense and lasting, but less intense. Charcoal was also used, especially in braziers. It burned hotter than wood and produced less smoke. But making charcoal required burning wood slowly in controlled conditions, which took time and labour. Charcoal was more expensive and used more selectively. Keeping fires going required constant attention. Wood had to be added regularly. Coals had to be stirred to maintain airflow. Ash had to be removed so it did not smother the fire. This work fell to servants. In noble chambers, a servant was responsible for maintaining the fire through the night. This person slept in or near the chamber so they could wake periodically, check the fire, and add fuel if needed. The fire could not be allowed to go out entirely because relighting it from scratch was difficult, especially in the middle of the night. Starting a fire without a flame required a tinderbox. This was a small container holding flint, steel and tinder, usually charred cloth. Striking steel against flint produced sparks. If a spark landed on the tinder and the tinder was dry, it would begin to smoulder. Blowing gently on the smouldering tinder could coax it into a small flame, which could then be transferred to kindling and eventually to larger pieces of wood. This process took time and skill. It did not always work on the first attempt. In cold conditions, with stiff fingers and damp tinder, it could take many attempts, so fires were kept alive whenever possible, rather than extinguished and restarted. In the great hall, servants banked the fire before the household went to bed. In chambers with fireplaces, fires were tended carefully to ensure they lasted through the night. In rooms without fireplaces, people relied on residual heat from the day, their own body heat, and layers of fabric. The fire provided warmth, but only in small pockets. The rest of the castle remained cold, and as winter deepened, even the best-tended fire could not overcome the vastness of the stone around it. Fire did not tend itself. A fire left alone would burn through its fuel and die. The coals would cool, the warmth would fade. By morning, nothing would remain but a cold ash. So someone had to stay awake, or wake periodically, or sleep lightly enough to sense when the fire needed attention. In noble chambers, this task fell to a servant, often a young person chosen for their ability to wake easily and move quietly. They slept on a pallet near the door or in a small adjacent room. Their sleep was always partial. They listened for the fire even while resting. Every few hours the servant rose. They moved carefully in the darkness, guided by the dim glow of the coals. They knelt by the fireplace and examined what remained. If the coals were still red and hot, they added a piece of wood, not too large, so it would catch and burn slowly. If the coals had dimmed, they used an iron poker to stir them, breaking up ash, exposing the hottest parts, encouraging airflow. Sometimes the fire needed more than wood. It needed kindling. Small twigs or splinters of dry wood placed on top of the coals to create flames that would ignite the larger log. The servant kept a supply of kindling nearby for this purpose. If the fire had burned too low, if the coals were nearly out, the work became more difficult. The servant had to rebuild carefully. They placed the kindling in a small pile on the hottest coals. They blew gently, adding oxygen, urging the kindling to ignite. Once small flames appeared, they added progressively larger pieces until the fire was stable again. All of this was done in near silence. The household was sleeping, the lord and lady in their bed behind drawn curtains, other servants in nearby rooms. Waking them was not acceptable unless there was an emergency. The servants' hands grew cold as they worked. They knelt on stone which pulled heat from their knees and legs. The fire gave off some warmth, but only from one side. Their face and chest grew warm while their back remained cold. They worked quickly, not for comfort, but to return to their own palate, before the chills settled too deeply into their body. This routine repeated through the night. 2 times, 3 times, sometimes more, depending on how well the fire was burning and how cold the night was. Each time the servant woke, checked, tended, and returned to sleep. In the great hall the process was similar but larger in scale. The central hearth held more fuel and a bigger bed of coals. It burned longer between tendings, but it still required attention. A servant assigned to the hall slept nearby, often on a bench near the hearth itself. They woke periodically, added logs, stirred coals, ensured the fire did not go out completely. In rooms without fireplaces, where braziers were used, the work was different. Braziers held less fuel and burned through it faster. A brazier might need attention every hour. The servant responsible for it had even less uninterrupted sleep. They also had to be more careful. A brazier that tipped over could start a fire that would spread to rushes, wooden furniture, bedding. So they checked not only the coals, but also the stability of the brazier itself, ensuring it had not shifted. Fuel storage was part of the work. Wood and peat had to be kept dry. Damp fuel did not burn well. It produced more smoke and less heat. So wood was stacked indoors in alcoves or storage rooms near where it would be used. Servants carried it from storage to the fire as needed. This meant moving through cold corridors, sometimes multiple times a night, arms loaded with logs. In large castles there might be several fires to tend. The great hall, the lord's chamber, perhaps a guest chamber. Each fire required its own servant or a single servant moving between them. This person's night was broken into short intervals of sleep punctuated by work. The labour was taken for granted. It was not considered exceptional or worthy of particular notice. It was simply what had to be done to maintain warmth. Servants who performed this work were not thanked each morning. Their success was measured by the absence of complaint. If the fire was still burning when the household woke, the work had been done properly. Failure had consequences. A fire that went out meant a cold morning. Relighting it took time. The household would begin the day in discomfort. The servant responsible might face reprimand or worse. So they learned to wake reliably. They developed an internal sense of time, an awareness of how long a fire could burn before it needed attention. Some developed the ability to assess a fire at a glance, to know immediately whether it needed wood, stirring, or kindling. This knowledge was practical and essential. The work was repetitive. Night after night, winter after winter. The same motions, the same cold stone under the knees, the same effort to coax heat from wood and air. And through it all, the castle remained cold. The fires created small zones of warmth, but they could not overcome the stone. The servants' work kept those zones alive. Without it, even those small pockets of heat would have vanished. Windows were not designed for comfort. They were openings in the stone sized and placed for specific reasons. In the Great Hall, windows near the roofline allowed smoke to escape. Lower windows provided light during the day. In defensive towers, windows doubled as arrow slits. Narrow to the outside, wider within, glass was rare. In the early medieval period, almost no castle windows had glass. Glass production required specialised knowledge and materials. The glass that did exist was thick, uneven and greenish. It was used for churches and the wealthiest households, not for ordinary castle chambers. Most windows were simply open to the air. In warm weather, this was tolerable. In winter, it was not. Wooden shutters covered many windows. These were hinged panels that could be closed from the inside and secured with a latch. A shutter blocked wind and reduced the amount of cold air entering the room, but it also blocked light. Once a shutter was closed, the room became dark, so shutters were often left open during the day, even in winter, to allow what little daylight there was to enter. They were closed at night or when wind became too strong. Shutters did not seal tightly. The wood warped over time. Gaps appeared between the shutter and the window frame. Cold air moved through those gaps steadily. A person standing near a shuttered window could feel the draft. It was not a gust, but a constant flow of cold air entering the room. Some windows were covered with oiled cloth instead of shutters. Linen or another fabric was soaked in oil or fat, which made it somewhat translucent and resistant to water. This cloth was stretched across the window opening and fastened to the frame. It allowed some light through while blocking most of the wind. But oiled cloth deteriorated. It tore. It became brittle in cold weather. It required replacement regularly, and even when intact, it did not provide much insulation. Cold radiated through it. Drafts still found their way around the edges where it was fastened. In some regions, people used animal membrane for windows. Bladders or intestines from sheep or pigs, stretched thin and dried, became semi-transparent. This material was used similarly to oiled cloth. It was slightly more durable but still not effective at blocking cold. Arrow slits were permanent openings. They could not be closed. Their design required that they remain open at all times, in case the castle came under attack, so cold air flowed through them continuously. An arrow slit was narrow on the exterior side, sometimes only a few inches wide. This made it difficult for attackers to shoot arrows inward. But on the interior side, the slit widened to allow the defender a greater field of vision and movement. This wider interior opening meant more cold air entered. In winter, an arrow slit acted like a channel for cold. Air from outside, already below freezing, funneled into the room. It pulled near the opening and then spread outward. A person sitting near an arrow slit it would feel the cold immediately. Even across the room the effect was noticeable. Tapestries helped. Heavy woven fabric hung on the walls created a barrier between the stone and the room. Air behind the tapestry remained colder than the air in front of it. The tapestry slowed the transfer of cold from the wall to the living space. It also reduced drafts from arrow slits and gaps in the masonry. But tapestries did not eliminate the problem. They muffled it. Cold air still moved. Drafts still existed. On particularly windy nights, tapestries would shift and ripple, moved by the air flowing behind them. Doorways were another source of drafts. Doors were thick, made from heavy oak or other hardwood, reinforced with iron bands. They were designed to resist force, not to seal tightly. Gaps existed around the frame. Cold air moved through these gaps continuously. Each time a door opened, cold air rushed in. The temperature difference between the corridor and the room created airflow. Warm air from the room moved outward into the corridor. Cold air from the corridor moved inward into the room. Opening a door even briefly meant losing a measurable amount of warmth. Servants opened doors frequently. They moved between rooms carrying items, performing tasks, checking on the household. Each passage meant another exchange of air. Over the course of a night, this added up. The room lost heat steadily, not in dramatic bursts, but in small constant increments. Floors contributed to drafts as well. Cold air is denser than warm air. It sinks, so cold air entering through windows, arrow slits and doors settled at floor level. It moved slowly across the stone floor, spreading outward until it filled the lower portion of the room. People sleeping in beds were elevated above the floor. This helped. The coldest air remained below them. But anyone sleeping on a pallet or bench at floor level felt the full force of it. Corridors and stairways created their own draft patterns. A corridor was essentially a wind tunnel. Air moved through it from one end to the other, driven by temperature differences or external wind. Stairways acted as vertical channels. Cold air from lower levels rose through them, or warm air from upper levels descended, depending on conditions. The result was a castle filled with moving air. Not still, stagnant cold, but active cold. Cold that flowed, that shifted, that found every gap an opening. There was no solution to this within the constraints of castle design. Windows were necessary for light and ventilation. Doors were necessary for access. Arrow slits were necessary for defense. Each one compromised the ability to retain heat. People adapted by layering defenses. Tapestries on walls, bed curtains around sleeping spaces, shutters closed at night, doors kept shut whenever possible. Each layer reduced drafts slightly, but none eliminated them. So the cold moved through the castle steady and persistent, and the people inside moved through it, wrapping themselves in wool and fur, seeking the small warm spaces where fire and fabric provided temporary relief. Fabric hung on stone walls, not for decoration alone, though tapestries were often beautiful. Woven scenes of hunts, battles, religious imagery, daily life. Rich colours from expensive dyes. Months or years of labour invested in their creation. But beauty was secondary. The primary function of a tapestry in winter was to slow the transfer of cold. Stone walls radiated cold into the room. A person standing near a bare stone wall could feel it without touching the surface. Heat from their body moved toward the wall and disappeared into it. This happened continuously. An invisible drainage of warmth. A tapestry created a barrier. The woven wool hung a few inches from the wall, sometimes more. This gap trapped a layer of air between fabric and stone. Air is a poor conductor of heat. The trapped air slowed the movement of cold from the stone into the room. The effect was modest but real. A room with tapestries felt slightly warmer than a room with bare walls. Not warm, but less aggressively cold. The difference was noticeable to people who lived there. Tapestries were made of wool. Wool has natural insulating properties. The fibres trap air within their structure. A thick woolen tapestry hanging on a wall added mass and texture that further impeded the flow of cold. The heaviest tapestries were used in the most important rooms. The Lord's Chamber, the Great Hall, chambers where guests stayed. These tapestries might weigh hundreds of pounds. Lifting them and hanging them required multiple people and sturdy iron hooks driven into the mortar between stones. Lesser rooms made do with simpler hangings. Undyed wool, rough weaving, less artistic but functional. Even a plain wool cloth helped. Some walls had multiple layers. A tapestry hung over a layer of fabric or leather, attached directly to the stone. Each layer added more trapped air, more insulation. The cumulative effect was better than a single hanging alone. In corners where two walls met, tapestries overlapped. This was intentional. Corners were particularly cold. Two stone surfaces met at an angle, and cold radiated from both directions. Overlapping tapestries in corners created a thicker barrier in the place where it was most needed. Tapestries also blocked drafts. Gaps in the masonry, small cracks between stones, allowed air to seep through. A tapestry covered these gaps. Air still moved behind the fabric, but it did not enter the room directly. The tapestry diffused the draft, spreading it out, reducing its force. On windy nights, tapestries moved. The fabric rippled and swayed. This indicated air moving behind it, flowing through the gaps it covered. But the movement was gentle. The draft reaching the people in the room was diminished. Maintaining tapestries required effort. Dust accumulated on them. Smoke from fires left residue. Moths were a constant threat. Woolen fabric was food for moth larvae. A tapestry left unattended could be damaged extensively by insects. So tapestries were taken down periodically, carried outside and beaten to remove dust. They were inspected for moth damage. Small holes could be repaired. Larger damage meant sections had to be rewoven or patched. This work was done by skilled women in the household or by professional weavers brought in for the purpose. In summer, some tapestries were stored. The rooms did not need insulation when the weather was warm. Storing tapestries protected them from unnecessary exposure to light and air, which caused fading and deterioration. They were folded carefully, sometimes with herbs like lavender or wormwood placed between the folds to deter insects. When winter approached, the tapestries were brought back out. They were hung in place, transforming bare stone walls into fabric-covered surfaces. The process marked the seasonal shift. Once the tapestries were up, the household knew winter had arrived. Not every wall could be covered. Walls near fireplaces were left bare or covered with less flammable materials. A tapestry too close to flames could ignite. Fire safety required that some stone remain exposed, particularly around hearths and fireplaces. Windows posed a problem. Tapestries could not hang directly over windows without blocking all light. So windows remained vulnerable points. Some households hung shorter pieces of fabric above or beside windows to reduce drafts without completely covering the opening. This was a compromise. In the Great Hall, tapestries hung high on the walls above the reach of people moving about. They covered large expanses of stone. The hall's walls were tall, so the tapestries were correspondingly large. Hanging them required scaffolding or tall ladders. Once in place, they stayed up for the season. In private chambers, tapestries were smaller and easier to manage. A single person could take one down or put one up, though help made the work faster. Nobles sometimes brought their own tapestries when travelling between residences. These personal tapestries were rolled, transported, and hung wherever the noble stayed. Familiar fabric on unfamiliar walls provided continuity. The visual effect of tapestries was significant. A stone room felt hard and cold even to the eye. A room covered in fabric felt softer, more enclosed. The psychological impact mattered. People felt more comfortable in a room that looked warm, even if the actual temperature difference was small. But the primary purpose remained practical. Tapestries were insulation. They were one element in a larger strategy of layering defences against the cold. Walls covered with fabric, shutters closed over windows, bed curtains drawn around sleeping spaces. Each layer contributed. Without tapestries, the cold from stone walls would have been more immediate and more severe. With them, the cold was still present but muted. The stone's chill reached the room more slowly, giving fires and body heat a better chance to maintain pockets of warmth. This was not a solution, it was mitigation. The castle remained cold, but tapestries made it slightly less cold, and in winter, that difference mattered. The Great Hall was the centre of daily life. During the day, it held the household. Meals were served there. Work was done there. Gatherings and assemblies took place there. The central hearth burned continuously, providing light and some warmth. People moved in and out, voices echoed off the stone walls, the space was active. As evening approached, the activity gradually slowed. The final meal of the day ended. Servants cleared trestle tables, lifting the boards from their supports and stacking them against the walls. The supports, usually simple wooden frames, were moved aside as well. This cleared the floor space. Benches remained. Long wooden benches where people had sat to eat. Some of these benches would become sleeping places. Not everyone in the castle had a private chamber. Servants, lower-ranking members of the household, soldiers, travellers passing through, many of these people slept in the Great Hall. This was expected. The hall served multiple functions. At night, it became a dormitory. The central hearth continued to burn, but the fire was reduced. Large logs were allowed to burn down, the remaining coals were spread out and covered lightly with ash, banking the fire for the night. This process slowed combustion, preserving coals until morning while reducing the amount of heat and light the fire produced. A banked fire glowed faintly. It did not provide enough warmth to heat the hall, but it kept the coals alive. Standing close to it, a person could feel some heat. A few feet away, the warmth faded to nothing. People settled into their sleeping places. Those with status slept on the benches. Lying on wood was more comfortable than lying on stone. A bench also elevated a person above the coldest air which settled at floor level. Servants and others of lower ranks slept on the floor. They laid down straw pallets, thin mattresses stuffed with straw or hay. These provided some cushioning and a slight barrier between their bodies and the stone. But the floor was cold. The stone pulled heat from anyone lying on it. Everyone slept fully dressed. Removing clothing at night was not practical. The air was too cold. People wore the same tunics, hose, and layers they had worn during the day. Some added cloaks, woolen cloaks, heavy and coarse, wrapped around the body and pulled tight. Fur-lined cloaks for those who had them. Blankets were shared or scarce. A household of limited means might have few blankets to distribute. People doubled up, lying close together, to share warmth and covering. Families slept together. Servants who worked together slept near each other. The hall grew quiet. Conversations faded. The fire's glow dimmed. Outside the night was fully dark. Inside, a few candles or small oil lamps provided minimal light near the hearth, enough for a servant to see by if they needed to tend the fire. The temperature dropped steadily. With the fire banked and no other heat source, the hall lost warmth. The high ceiling meant that any residual warm air rose far above the sleeping people. Cold air settled in layers across the floor. Drafts moved through the hall. Doors at either end were closed but not sealed. Windows high on the walls leaked cold air. The movement of air was constant but slow, not wind, just circulation. Cold air flowing in, slightly warmer air flowing out, an ongoing exchange that ensured the hall never retained heat. People adjusted their positions. They pulled cloaks tighter. They shifted closer to others. They curled into themselves, minimizing exposed surface area. These adjustments were made half-consciously, the body seeking comfort even in sleep. Breathing was visible. Each exhalation produced a small cloud of vapor. The moisture in a breath condensed in the cold air, then dispersed. This happened with every breath, all night. Dozens of people breathing clouds of vapor into the darkness. The stone floor radiated cold upward. Those sleeping on pallets felt it through the thin straw. The cold penetrated fabric and worked its way into muscles and bones. People woke periodically, uncomfortable, shifting position, trying to find a way to lie that reduced contact with the floor. A servant assigned to watch the fire dozed near the hearth. They were responsible for ensuring the coals did not go out entirely. Every few hours they woke, stirred the coals, added a small piece of wood if necessary. This was done quietly. The rest of the household was not to be disturbed. Sometimes a dog or two slept in the hall. Dogs were useful for hunting and guarding. They were allowed inside and they sought warmth like everyone else. A dog might lie near the hearth or curl up next to a sleeping person, sharing body heat. This was tolerated, even welcomed. In the coldest part of the night, usually the hours before dawn, the hall reached its lowest temperature. The fire had been banked for hours. No new heat entered the space. The stone walls and floor had released whatever warmth they held during the day. What remained was cold, still, and heavy. People slept lightly. Deep sleep was difficult in such conditions. The body remained alert to discomfort, ready to adjust. Dreams were brief and fragmented. Waking and sleeping blurred into each other. Morning came slowly. The first light appeared high in the windows, dim and grey. The servant by the hearth rose and began rekindling the fire. They uncovered the coals, added kindling, blew gently to encourage flames. Smoke rose thicker than it had been during the night. The fire began to crackle. Others woke gradually. They stirred, sat up, pulled cloaks around themselves against the morning cold. The hall came back to life, not quickly but steadily. Pallets were rolled up and moved aside, benches were repositioned, tables were brought out and set up for the morning meal. The great hall transitioned from sleeping space back to communal space. This happened every morning, winter after winter. The cycle repeated without variation. Sleep, wake, clear, prepare, begin the day. And when night came again, the process reversed. To reach a private chamber from the great hall required walking through the castle. Corridors connected different parts of the structure. These passages were not heated. They had no fireplaces, no braziers, no source of warmth except the occasional person passing through. They were enclosed by the stone on all sides. Walls, floor, ceiling. All stone, all cold. In daylight, corridors were dim. Windows were few and small, designed for defense rather than illumination. Whatever light entered was pale and insufficient. Shadows filled the spaces between. At night, corridors were nearly black. A person moving through them carried a candle or a small oil lamp. The flame provided a circle of light a few feet across, enough to see the immediate path but nothing beyond. The rest of the corridor remained dark. The cold in a corridor was different from the cold in a room. A room with a fire, even a small one, had some warmth. A corridor had none. It was pure cold, undiluted. Walking into a corridor from a room with a fire felt like stepping outside. The air in the corridor was still and dense. Cold air is heavier than warm air, and it settled into the lowest parts of the castle. Corridors on lower levels were colder than those above. But even upper corridors were frigid. Stone walls on either side radiated cold. A person walking down a corridor felt it from both directions. Heat left their body and moved toward the walls. The longer they walked, the more heat they lost. Floors were stone or sometimes packed earth covered with rushes. The rushes helped slightly, providing a thin layer between foot and stone. But they did little to prevent cold from rising through the floor. Each step pressed the foot down, compressing the rushes, bringing it closer to the cold surface beneath. Breath condensed immediately in the corridor air. A person exhaled, and a cloud of vapour formed in front of their face. It lingered for a moment before dispersing. This happened with every breath, a visible reminder of the temperature difference between body and environment. Doorways along the corridor led to various chambers. Some doors were closed, others slightly ajar. A closed door meant the people inside wanted privacy or were trying to conserve warmth. An open door meant the room was unoccupied, or the occupants did not mind the cold draught from the corridor. Passing an open door, a person might glimpse the interior. A fire burning in a fireplace, tapestries on the walls, a bed with drawn curtains. These were privileged spaces, warmer than the corridor. The contrast was stark. Servants moved through corridors frequently. They carried items between rooms. Firewood from storage to chambers, water in pitchers, food from the kitchen, waste in chamber pots to be emptied. Each task required walking through cold passages, often multiple times. Servants wore layers, but their clothing was not as heavy as that of nobles. They needed to move freely to work without restriction. Too much bulk made tasks difficult, so they endured the cold with less insulation. Their bodies adapted over time, but the cold was still felt. At night, the number of people in the corridors decreased. Most of the household was sleeping. Only a few servants moved about, tending fires or performing other necessary tasks. Their footsteps echoed in the empty passages. The sound travelled far in the stillness. Spiral staircases connected different levels of the castle. These staircases were enclosed in stone towers. The stairs wound upward or downward in tight circles. The walls of the stairwell were close, and the air inside was trapped. Cold air pooled in stairwells. If the stairs led down to lower levels, cold air from those levels rose into the stairwell and stayed there. If the stairs led up, cold air from outside or from unheated upper rooms sank down. Either way, the stairwell became a reservoir of cold. Climbing or descending stairs meant moving through this cold. The effort of climbing generated some body heat, but it was not enough to offset the chill. A person reaching the top of a staircase was both tired from the climb and colder than when they started. Staircases were narrow, built that way for defense. A narrow staircase could be held by one or two defenders against many attackers. But the narrowness also meant less space for air to circulate. The cold was concentrated. In some castles, corridors were long. Walking from one end to the other took time. A person carrying something heavy moved slowly. The cold had more time to work on them. By the time they reached their destination, their hands were stiff, their face numb. Nobles avoided the corridors when possible. If they needed to go from one part of the castle to another, they did so quickly. They wore heavy cloaks and moved with purpose. The corridor was a space to pass through, not to linger in. Children in the castle learned early to move quickly through cold spaces. Running generated warmth. Playing games that involved running through corridors and rooms kept children warmer than standing still. But running was not always allowed, especially near chambers where adults were sleeping or working. In deep winter, frost formed on the walls of corridors. Ice crystals appeared in corners and along surfaces where moisture had condensed and frozen. This happened especially in corridors near exterior walls or in parts of the castle that were less used. The frost was visible during the day, a thin white coating on grey stone. At night, by candlelight, it sparkled faintly. A person passing close enough could see their breath freeze onto their cloak or hair if they stayed in the corridor too long. Some corridors had no windows at all. These were interior passages, completely enclosed. The darkness in these places was absolute without a light source. The cold in them was also more intense because no sunlight ever reached them, even during the day. A person walking through such a corridor felt the walls closing in. The flame of their candle was the only point of reference. Beyond it, nothing. The floor beneath their feet, the walls to either side, the ceiling above. all were invisible, known only by touch and memory. To reach a bedchamber at night meant accepting this journey. The comfort of a bed and a fire was on the other side of the cold corridor, but the corridor had to be crossed. There was no avoiding it. So people moved through quickly, enduring the cold as a necessary transition between warmer spaces. Not everyone slept in the Great Hall. Those of higher rank had private chambers, rooms reserved for their use alone or shared with their immediate family. These chambers were a privilege, a marker of status within the household. The lord and lady of the castle had the best chamber. It was larger than others, often located in the keep or the most defensible part of the structure. The walls were covered with the finest tapestries. The bed was the largest and most elaborate. A fireplace, if the castle had one, was in this room. The chamber was still cold. Even with a fire and tapestries, the stone held its chill. But it was less cold than the Great Hall, less cold than the corridors. The difference was significant. The bed in the Lord's chamber was a four-poster. 4 vertical posts rose from the corners of the bed frame, supporting a canopy above and curtains on all sides. The curtains were heavy fabric, often wool or velvet. They could be drawn closed, enclosing the bed completely. This created a room within a room. The curtained bed was a small contained space. Body heat from the people sleeping inside accumulated and stayed there. The curtains blocked drafts. The canopy above prevented warm air from rising and escaping. Sleeping inside a curtained bed was noticeably warmer than sleeping outside it. Not warm by modern standards, but warmer than the open chamber. The curtains made the critical difference. The mattress was stuffed with feathers. Feather mattresses were expensive and reserved for the wealthy. Feathers provided cushioning and some insulation. The mattress sat on a frame of wooden slats or rope webbing, elevating it above the floor. Beneath the feather mattress, sometimes there was a second mattress stuffed with straw or wool for additional support. Sheets were linen. Linen was cooler than wool, which seems counterintuitive for winter. But linen was used for sheets because it was smoother against the skin. Wool blankets and fur coverlets were piled on top of the sheets for warmth. Sometimes several layers of blankets, heavy and thick. The lord and lady went to bed wearing linen undergarments, a long shirt or chemise that reached the knees or ankles. Over this, some people wore a woolen tunic or gown. Fur-lined bedrobes were used by the wealthiest. These were loose garments designed specifically for sleeping, warmer than day clothes, but more comfortable than wearing a full outer cloak to bed. Caps or hoods were worn to bed. The head lost heat quickly, and covering it helped retain warmth. Woolen caps, sometimes lined with fur, were common. They fit snugly and stayed in place through the night. Once in bed, the curtains were drawn by the occupants or by a servant. The curtains overlapped at the opening, ensuring no gap remained. Inside, the darkness was complete. No light entered. The enclosure was total. The warmth built slowly. At first, the bedding and the air inside the curtains were cold. The bodies in the bed radiated heat, and that heat began to accumulate. After a period of time, the space warmed to a tolerable level. Not comfortable by modern standards, but endurable. Breathing added moisture to the air inside the curtains. This moisture had nowhere to go. It condensed on the inside of the fabric, making the curtains slightly damp by morning. This dampness was uncomfortable but unavoidable. The fireplace in the chamber was tended through the night. A servant slept in the room, usually on a pallet near the door or in a small alcove. This servant woke periodically to add wood to the fire. The fire provided some warmth to the room, though most of the heat rose to the ceiling or was absorbed by the stone walls. The fire also provided psychological comfort. Its glow, visible through gaps in the bed curtains if they were not fully closed, was a reminder that warmth existed. The sound of the fire, the crackle and pop of burning wood, was familiar and reassuring. Other members of the household with higher status also had private chambers. These were smaller than the Lord's chamber and less well appointed. The bed might be a simpler four-poster, or just a large wooden frame with a mattress. Curtains might be thinner, less expensive fabric. The fireplace might be smaller or absent entirely. In chambers without a fireplace, a brazier was used. The brazier was placed in the centre of the room or near the bed, far enough from fabric to avoid fire risk but close enough to provide some heat. The coals in the brazier were tended less frequently than a fireplace fire, so the heat was less consistent. Some chambers were shared by siblings or by a noble, and their personal servants. Sharing a room meant sharing warmth. Multiple bodies in one space contributed to a higher overall temperature. Sharing a bed was common for this reason. 2 or 3 people sleeping together generated more heat than one person alone. Privacy was limited, even in the private chambers. Servants entered and exited to tend fires, bring water, remove waste, assist with dressing and undressing. The door was not locked. It could be barred from the inside for security, but during normal times it remained accessible. This was expected. Privacy as a concept existed but was understood differently than it is today. Children of noble families slept in chambers near their parents or in a separate nursery attended by servants. Their bedding was similar but scaled down. Smaller beds, lighter blankets. Children generated less body heat than adults, so they were often bundled more heavily, or slept with a nurse or servant who provided additional warmth. Guest chambers existed in larger castles. These were kept ready for visitors of status. The quality of these chambers reflected the household's wealth and the importance of the expected guest. Fresh rushes on the floor, clean linens on the bed, a fire lit before the guest arrived. These preparations were part of hospitality. A guest arriving in winter was shown to their chamber and offered wine or ale to warm them after travelling through the cold. The host ensured the chamber was as comfortable as possible within the limitations of the structure. This was a matter of reputation. A household that could not provide decent accommodations for a guest was judged poorly. But even the best guest chamber was still a stone room in a cold castle. The hospitality extended only as far as the household's resources allowed. The guest was expected to understand this. They brought their own heavy cloaks, their own expectations adjusted to reality. The difference between a private chamber and the Great Hall was significant. In the hall, a person slept surrounded by others, with minimal warmth and no privacy. In a chamber, they slept in a smaller space with more control over their environment. The fire, the bed curtains, the ability to exclude others, all of these contributed to a better night's rest. But better is relative. A private chamber was still cold. The stone was still there, holding its chill. The draught still found their way in. The night was still long and dark. The difference was one of degree, not of kind. Everyone in the castle, regardless of status, faced the same fundamental challenge: staying warm enough to sleep through a winter night. The bed was the warmest place in the castle, not warm in an absolute sense, but warmer than anywhere else. The bed was designed for this purpose, or every element of its construction contributed to creating and preserving heat. The frame was wood, usually oak. Oak is dense and heavy, resistant to warping. The frame needed to support significant weight. The mattresses, the sleepers, the heavy blankets and furs. It was built solidly, with thick posts and strong joinery. The 4 posts at the corners rose 6 feet or more. At the top they were connected by horizontal beams. These beams supported the canopy, a piece of fabric that covered the top of the bed. The canopy was wool or sometimes velvet. It hung flat across the top, preventing warm air from rising out of the bed space. Curtains hung from the canopy frame on all 4 sides. These were the same heavy fabric as the canopy, or sometimes even thicker. Each curtain panel could be drawn closed or pulled back and tied to the posts. When closed, the curtains overlapped at the corners and at the foot of the bed, ensuring no gaps. The result was an enclosed box. The bed became a small room, separated from the larger chamber by layers of fabric. Inside this box, warmth could accumulate in a way it could not in the open chamber. The mattress was the foundation. For nobles, a feather mattress was standard. Goose or duck feathers were collected, cleaned and stuffed into a large fabric casing. The casing was sewn shut. The mattress was thick and sometimes a foot or more in depth. It compressed under weight, but provided cushioning and insulation. Feathers trap air. Thousands of small spaces between the feathers held still air, which insulated the body from the cold below. This was not intentional in the sense of scientific understanding, but it was effective. A feather mattress kept the sleeper warmer than sleeping on straw or on the wooden bed frame itself. For those who could not afford feathers, mattresses were stuffed with straw, hay or wool. These materials provided less insulation but were better than nothing. A straw mattress compressed more quickly and needed to be refilled regularly as the straw broke down. Wool held up better, but was more expensive than straw. The mattress sat on a foundation. In some beds, this was a lattice of rope strung across the frame. The ropes were woven in a tight pattern to support the mattress evenly. In other beds, wooden slats were laid across the frame. Both methods elevated the mattress above the frame, allowing some air circulation beneath and reducing direct contact with cold wood. Sheets covered the mattress, linen sheets woven from flax. Linen was cooler to the touch than wool, which was why it was used next to the skin, but linen alone was not enough in winter. On top of the bottom sheet, sleepers piled blankets. Woolen blankets were the primary covering. Heavy, coarse wool woven into thick fabric. One blanket was rarely sufficient. 2, 3, 4 blankets were layered on top of each other. The combined weight was significant. The blankets pressed down on the sleeper, which was part of their function. Weight held the blankets in place and pressed them against the body, reducing air gaps where warmth could escape. Fur coverlets were the top layer for those who could afford them. Bearskin, wolfskin, sheepskin. The fur side faced up and the leather side faced down. Fur provided excellent insulation. The dense hair trapped air and blocked drafts. A fur coverlet was warmer than several wool blankets combined. Not everyone had fur. It was expensive and required access to animals, either through hunting or trade. Those without fur made do with additional wool blankets or with quilted coverlets, fabric layers stitched together with wool batting in between. Pillows were stuffed with feathers for the wealthy, with straw or wool for others. They provided support for the head and neck, but they also kept the head off the cold mattress. A person's head loses heat quickly. Elevating it slightly and surrounding it with insulating material helped retain warmth. Getting into bed was a process. A person did not simply lie down. First they removed their outer garments, or they kept them on depending on how cold the room was. They climbed onto the bed, often using a step stool because the mattress was elevated. They positioned themselves under the blankets and furs, pulling the coverings up to their chin. The initial contact with the bedding was cold. The sheets, the blankets, the furs, all had been sitting in the cold chamber. They held no warmth until body heat began to transfer into them. This took time. The first minutes in bed were uncomfortable. The body shivered, generating heat. Gradually, the bedding absorbed that heat and began to retain it. Drawing the curtains around the bed was the final step. This was done from inside by reaching out and pulling the fabric closed. Once the curtains were shut, the enclosed space was ready to retain warmth. The sleeper lay still, minimizing movement, allowing their body heat to fill the small volume inside the curtains. The warmth accumulated slowly. It was not a sudden change, but a gradual easing of discomfort. After a period of time, the space inside the curtains reached a temperature that was noticeably warmer than the chamber outside. Not warm enough to be comfortable by modern standards, but warm enough to allow sleep. Breathing added moisture to the air inside the curtains. This moisture condensed on the fabric, especially on the coldest parts of the curtains, which were the sections closest to the exterior walls of the chamber. By morning, the curtains were damp to the touch. This dampness was unpleasant but expected. It was part of sleeping in an enclosed space. The curtains also blocked light. Inside the bed, it was completely dark. This darkness was beneficial for sleep. There were no windows in the bed space, no way for early morning light to enter. Sleep could continue until the person chose to wake or until a servant opened the curtains. Sound was muffled inside the curtains. The heavy fabric absorbed noise from the chamber and from elsewhere in the castle. This created a sense of isolation. The sleeper was separated from the rest of the household, alone or with their partner, in a small, warm, dark space. The bed was a refuge. Outside the curtains, the chamber was cold. Beyond the chamber, the corridors and the great hall were colder still, but inside the bed, within the curtained enclosure, warmth existed. It was fragile and limited, but it was real. This was the goal of all the preparations. The layers of fabric, the heavy blankets, the enclosed space, all were designed to create a pocket of warmth where sleep could happen. Without this, sleep would have been far more difficult, perhaps impossible on the coldest nights. The bed was not just furniture, it was a survival tool. It allowed people to rest despite the cold, to wake in the morning functional and ready to face another day. It was the culmination of generations of accumulated knowledge about how to stay warm in a stone building in winter. And every night, in castles across medieval Europe, people climbed into these beds, drew the curtains, and settled into the small warm spaces they had created. They slept and they survived. People went to bed wearing their clothes, Not all of their clothes, but most of them. The distinction between day clothing and night clothing was minimal. What mattered was warmth, and warmth came from layers. The base layer was linen, a long shirt or chemise that reached past the knees, sometimes to the ankles. Linen was worn next to the skin because it absorbed moisture. Bodies perspired even in cold conditions, especially under multiple layers of fabric. Linen drew that moisture away from the skin, keeping it drier and therefore warmer. The linen undergarment was the same one worn during the day. Taking it off at night meant exposing bare skin to cold air, which was uncomfortable and impractical, so it stayed on. In the morning, the same garment continued to be worn. Linen was washed periodically, but not daily. Water had to be heated, and washing required effort. Clean linen was put on when available. Over the linen, people wore a tunic. For men, this was a wool garment that fell to mid-thigh or knee. For women, it was longer, reaching the ankles. The tunic was the primary outer garment during the day. At night, it remained on the body. Wool is an effective insulator. The fibres contain natural oils that repel some moisture. Wool also retains warmth even when damp. This made it essential for winter clothing. A wool tunic provided the main layer of insulation between the body and the cold air. Hose covered the legs. These were wool or linen stockings that reached the thigh. They were tied to a belt or to the tunic itself to hold them in place. Hose stayed on at night. Bare legs in winter were not tolerable. The cold attacked exposed skin immediately. Footwear varied. Some people wore soft leather shoes or boots to bed. Others removed their shoes but kept on thick wool socks. Feet were vulnerable to cold. The stone floor radiated chill upward, and even with bed coverings, feet could become uncomfortably cold during the night. Keeping them covered was necessary. Over the tunic, another layer was often added. A second tunic, slightly looser than the first, or a gown. These additional layers trapped air between them, creating insulation. The more layers, the more air trapped, the warmer the body stayed. Cloaks were common bedwear. A heavy woolen cloak, the same one worn outdoors during the day, was wrapped around the body at night. Cloaks were large pieces of fabric, often semicircular, that enveloped the wearer. They could be pulled tight and held closed by hand or by a brooch. For those who had them, fur-lined cloaks were even better. The fur faced inward against the body, while the wool faced outward. Fur was warmer than wool alone. Rabbit, fox, squirrel or sheep fur was common. Wealthier individuals had cloaks lined with more expensive furs like marten or sable. The cloak stayed on throughout the night. Even inside the bed, under blankets, the cloak provided an additional layer. It could be adjusted as needed. If too warm, it could be loosened. If cold, it could be pulled tighter. Caps or hoods covered the head. Heat escaped rapidly from an uncovered head. Wool caps fitted close to the skull were standard. Some caps had flaps that covered the ears. Hoods, attached to cloaks or worn separately, provided even more coverage, wrapping around the head and neck. Women sometimes wore wimples to bed. A wimple was a cloth that wrapped around the head, neck and chin, leaving only the face exposed. It served both as a head covering and as additional insulation for the neck, which was another area where heat escaped quickly. Gloves or mittens were occasionally worn to bed on the coldest nights. Hands extended from under the covers could become painfully cold. Wool mittens kept fingers warm enough to allow sleep without discomfort. The layering was not uniform across all people. Wealth determined how many garments a person owned and how warm those garments were. A noble might wear a linen chemise, a wool tunic, a skin wool gown, a fur-lined cloak, a wool cap lined with fur, and have multiple blankets on top. A servant might have a single linen shirt, a thin wool tunic, a worn cloak, and share a blanket with another servant. But the principle was the same for everyone. Multiple layers of fabric trapped air. Air is a poor conductor of heat. The more air trapped between layers, the slower heat escaped from the body. This was understood through experience, not through scientific theory, but the understanding was accurate. Layering also allowed adjustment. If a person became too warm, which could happen after the body heat accumulated inside the bed curtains, a layer could be removed or loosened. If too cold, layers of wool could be tightened or additional coverings pulled up. Children wore similar layers scaled to their size. Infants were swaddled in linen and wool wrapped tightly to conserve body heat. Older children wore tunics, hose, and caps. They often slept with adults, sharing body heat and blankets. A child sleeping alone would have been colder and less comfortable. The clothing worn to bed became warm during the night. Body heat transferred into the fabric. By morning, the layers were noticeably warmer than they had been at bedtime. This residual warmth helped when a person first left the bed and faced the cold chamber. The clothing provided some protection during the transition from the warm bed to the cold room. Changing out of these clothes into fresh ones required removing the warm layers and putting on cold ones. This was unpleasant. So people often wore the same clothing for multiple days, sometimes longer. The clothing was aired out periodically, hung near a fire or in the sun to reduce odours and moisture, but full changes were infrequent. The layering strategy extended beyond just clothing. Blankets were layered in the same way. Sheet, then wool blanket, then another wool blanket, then fur or quilted coverlet. Each layer added insulation. The weight of the layers also helped, pressing down on the body and reducing air gaps. In the coldest parts of winter, people might add even more layers. Extra tunics, additional cloaks, more blankets. The bed became a pile of fabric with the sleeper somewhere in the middle, cocooned in wool and linen and fur. This was not luxury, it was necessity. Without layers, the body lost heat faster than it could generate it. Sleep became difficult or impossible. The cold penetrated through inadequate covering and woke the sleeper repeatedly. Layering was the only effective defence against the persistent chill of the stone castle, and so people layered. They wrapped themselves in fabric. They piled coverings on top of themselves. They created a barrier between their bodies and the cold air, the cold stone, the cold winter night. And within that barrier they found enough warmth to sleep. The mattress determined much of the night's comfort. For the wealthy, feather mattresses were the standard. Feathers were collected from geese and ducks. Waterfowl feathers were preferred because they were soft, light, and had good insulating properties. The birds were plucked during molting season when the feathers came out easily, or feathers were collected after the birds were slaughtered for meat. The feathers were cleaned before use. They were washed in water, sometimes with soap or lye, to remove dirt, oil, and debris. Then they were dried thoroughly. Damp feathers would mildew and rot inside the mattress casing. Drying took time, especially in winter when moisture lingered in everything. Once clean and dry, the feathers were stuffed into a large fabric bag called a tick. The tick was made from tightly woven linen or cotton. The weave had to be tight enough to contain the feathers and prevent them from poking through. The tick was sewn shut after being filled, with strong stitches that would not come apart under use. A feather mattress was thick, 12 inches or more of the compressed feathers. The mattress compressed further under the weight of a sleeper, but it still provided substantial cushioning. It also provided insulation. The air trapped between feathers reduced heat transfer from the body to the bed frame below. Feather mattresses required maintenance. They were taken outside periodically and beaten to redistribute the feathers and remove dust. They needed to be refilled over time as feathers broke down or were lost through small gaps in the ticking. This maintenance required effort and resources, which was why feather mattresses were expensive. For those who could not afford feathers, straw was the common alternative. Straw mattresses were called pallets. Straw was abundant and cheap. After grain was threshed, the stalks were collected and dried. This straw was then stuffed into a fabric casing, similar to the tick used for feathers but made from coarser material. A straw pallet was less comfortable than a feather mattress. Straw compressed more quickly and unevenly. Hard stalks poked through the fabric and pressed into the sleeper's body. The pallet had to be refilled frequently because straw broke down into dust and fragments. But straw provided some insulation. It kept the sleeper off the cold bed frame or floor. It was better than sleeping on bare wood or stone. For servants and lower-ranking household members, a straw pallet was the norm. Hay was also used. Hay was softer than straw and compressed less. It made a more comfortable mattress than straw, though still far inferior to feathers. Hay pallets were refilled more often than straw because hay decomposed faster. Wool was another option, better than straw but more expensive. Wool mattresses were made by carding wool into a loose mass and stuffing it into a tick. Wool compressed less than straw and was more comfortable. It also provided better insulation. Wool held warmth even when damp, which was useful in a cold, humid castle. Wool mattresses were found in households that could afford better than straw but not as much as feathers. They represented a middle tier of comfort and expense. Some beds had multiple mattresses. A straw or wool mattress formed the base, providing structure and some cushioning. A thinner feather mattress sat on top, providing the immediate comfort for the sleeper. This combination was common in noble beds. Sheets covered the mattress, the bottom sheet was linen, spread over the mattress surface. The sleeper lay on this sheet, not directly on the mattress. The sheet protected the mattress from dirt, sweat and wear. It was easier to wash a sheet than to clean a mattress. Linen sheets were smooth and cool to the touch. In winter, they felt cold initially. The sleeper's body heat warmed them over time. Linen absorbed moisture from the body, which helped keep the sleeper drier and therefore warmer. The top sheet covered the sleeper. It provided a barrier between the body and the heavier blankets above. The top sheet was also linen. In some households, the top sheet was omitted in winter, and blankets were placed directly over the sleeper to reduce layers and allow more direct warmth. Blankets were wool. Thick, heavy wool blankets woven from coarse yarn. These blankets were not soft, they were scratchy against skin, which was why linen sheets were used between the blanket and the sleeper. A single wool blanket weighed several pounds. Its weight was part of its function. The blanket pressed down on the sleeper, holding warmth close to the body and reducing air circulation that would carry heat away. Multiple blankets were layered, 2, 3, 4 blankets stacked on top of each other. The combined weight was significant. Some sleepers found the weight oppressive, but it was necessary for warmth. The blankets formed a heavy barrier against the cold. Fur coverlets were the top layer in wealthy households. A large animal skin, fur side up, spread across the bed. Bearskins were particularly prized for their size and warmth. Wolf, fox and sheepskin were also used. The fur provided exceptional insulation. The dense hair trapped air and blocked drafts. A fur coverlet was warmer than several wool blankets. It was also a status symbol. Owning a fur coverlet indicated wealth and access to hunting or trade. For those without fur, a quilted coverlet was an alternative. This was 2 layers of fabric stitched together with wool batting in between. The stitching created small pockets that held the batting in place. The result was a thick, insulated covering. Quilted coverlets were labour and intensive to make. They required fabric, batting, thread, and many hours of stitching, but they were effective. They provided warmth comparable to multiple blankets, but with less weight. Pillows were filled with feathers, straw or wool, depending on wealth. A feather pillow was soft and supportive. A straw pillow was lumpy and had to be reshaped frequently. A wool pillow was somewhere in between. The pillow elevated the head off the mattress. This was important for warmth. The head and neck lost heat quickly. Keeping them slightly elevated and surrounded by insulating material reduced heat loss. Some households used bolsters instead of pillows. A bolster was a long cylindrical cushion that ran the width of the bed. Sleepers rested their heads on the bolster, which supported the neck and head at a slight angle. Bolsters were filled with the same materials as pillows. All of these bedding materials required care. Mattresses were aired and beaten. Sheets were washed. Blankets were checked for moth damage and cleaned when necessary. Furs were brushed and stored properly to prevent deterioration. This maintenance was part of the household's routine. Servants did most of the work under the supervision of the household's mistress. Bedding represented a significant investment, and proper care extended its useful life. The quality of bedding materials directly affected the quality of sleep. A person with a feather mattress, linen sheets, multiple wool blankets, and a fur coverlet slept warmer and more comfortably than a person with a thin straw pallet and a single worn blanket. But everyone, regardless of status, relied on the same principle. Materials that trapped air, layered in sufficient quantity, created insulation. That insulation slowed the loss of body heat. And that slowed loss of heat made sleep possible in a cold stone castle in winter. Beds were rarely occupied by a single person. Sharing was common across all levels of society. Husbands and wives shared a bed. Siblings shared. Servants shared. Even guests might share if space was limited. This was practical, not just a matter of available space. Multiple bodies in one bed generated more heat than one body alone. A human body at rest produces warmth continuously. Metabolism generates heat as a byproduct of cellular processes. This heat radiates outward from the skin. In a cold environment, that heat disperses quickly into the surrounding air. But in a shared bed, some of that heat is absorbed by the person lying beside you. 2 people in a bed create a warmer microenvironment than one person. The space between them holds their combined heat. The blankets and bed curtains trap that heat. The result is a noticeably warmer sleeping space. 3 or more people amplified this effect. In households where space was tight or heating was minimal, multiple family members might sleep in the same bed. Children slept with parents, siblings slept together, in some cases 4 or 5 people shared a single large bed. This created practical challenges. Space was limited. Movement by one person disturbed others. Privacy was non-existent. But the warmth was worth the inconvenience. A child sleeping alone in a cold room would struggle through the night. A child sleeping between 2 parents or siblings stayed warmer and slept better. Servants often shared beds. 2 servants assigned to the same area of the household might share a pallet or a simple bed frame with a straw mattress. They pooled their body heat and whatever blankets they had. This arrangement was expected and accepted. In the great hall, people sleeping on the floor clustered together, families grouped. Servants who worked together lay near each other. The closer together, the warmer the collective space. A person sleeping isolated at the edge of the hall was colder than someone sleeping in the middle of a group. Dogs and cats contributed to warmth when they were allowed to sleep inside. A dog lying against a person's back or legs provided additional heat. Cats curled up near the chest or under blankets. These animals sought warmth themselves and were tolerated partly for the mutual benefit. The social rules around bed sharing were well established. Married couples shared a bed as a matter of course. This was their right and duty. The marriage bed was where intimacy occurred, but it was also simply where 2 people slept together for warmth and companionship. Siblings of the same sex shared beds without issue. Brothers slept together. Sisters slept together. This continued even into adulthood in some households, particularly where space was limited or where unmarried adult children remained in the household. Opposite-sex siblings stopped sharing beds at a certain age, usually around the onset of puberty. This was a matter of propriety. Once children reached an age where sexual awareness became relevant, they were separated into different sleeping arrangements. Guests presented special situations. A guest of high status might be given a private chamber with a bed to themselves, but guests of lower status, or households with limited space, might require guests to share. 2 male guests might share a bed without comment. The same for 2 female guests. Sharing a bed with a stranger was less common but not unknown. Travellers staying at an inn might share a bed with another traveller if the inn was full. This was accepted practice, though not preferred. The warmth benefit remained, even between strangers. Servants sometimes slept in the chambers of their masters, not in the same bed but in the same room. A personal servant might sleep on a pallet on the floor near the lord or lady's bed. They were there to respond to needs during the night, tending the fire, bringing water, assisting with chamber pots. These servants shared the ambient warmth of the chamber and its fireplace, but they did not share the master's bed. The social distinction was maintained even in sleeping arrangements. Wet nurses slept with the infants in their care. An infant could not maintain body heat effectively on its own. It needed to be kept close to an adult's body throughout the night. The wet nurse slept with the infant in her arms or tucked beside her, ensuring the child stayed warm. In peasant households outside the castle, entire families often slept together in a single large bed or on a common sleeping platform. The household might include parents, children, grandparents, and even live-in servants. All shared the same sleeping space. The combined body heat was essential for survival in poorly insulated cottages. This practice of communal sleeping had benefits beyond warmth. It reinforced family bonds. It provided comfort and security. Children grew up understanding that they were part of a collective, not isolated individuals. Sleep was a shared activity, a communal experience. But it also had drawbacks. Disease spread easily in shared beds. Illness passed from one person to another through close contact. Lice and other parasites transferred between sleepers. These were accepted risks, managed as best as possible through cleanliness practices, though those practices were limited by available resources. Snoring disrupted sleep. A person who snored loudly made the night uncomfortable for others sharing the bed. This was a common complaint but difficult to address. The snorer was usually not aware of the problem, and moving to a separate sleeping space meant sleeping alone in the cold. Body odour was another issue. People did not bathe frequently. Clothing was worn for extended periods without washing. The smell in a shared bed could be strong. This was normal and expected. Everyone smelled. The nose adapted. Bedwetting by children created problems in shared sleeping arrangements. The mattress absorbed urine, which was difficult to clean out completely. The smell lingered. Straw pallets could be emptied and refilled, but feather mattresses were more problematic. Children were trained early to use chamber pots at night to minimize accidents. Despite these challenges, sharing warmth remained standard practice. The benefits outweighed the discomforts. A warm, somewhat unpleasant night was better than a cold, miserable one. The concept of personal space during sleep was different from modern expectations. People were used to sleeping near others, touching others, sharing covers. This was normal life. Privacy and sleep was a luxury few had and fewer expected. And so they slept together, bodies arranged in beds, on pallets, on benches, on the floor, sharing breath, sharing warmth, sharing the long cold night. It was how they survived winter. It was how they rested. And when morning came, they rose together into another cold day, ready to repeat the cycle when night fell again. Sleep did not happen suddenly. It required preparation. As evening approached, the household began a series of tasks designed to make the night more endurable. These tasks were routine, performed in the same order each night, a ritual that marked the transition from day to night. The first task was securing the castle. Servants checked that exterior doors were barred. Shutters on ground-level windows were closed and latched from the inside. Gates were closed if the castle had them. This was a defensive measure, but it also reduced drafts and kept out some of the cold night air. Inside, fires needed attention. In the Great Hall, the large fire was allowed to burn down. Servants removed excess ash and spread the remaining coals across the hearth, then covered them lightly with ash. This banking process preserved the coals for morning while reducing the fire's heat output at night. In private chambers with fireplaces, fires were fed one last time before the household went to bed. Larger logs were added, the kind that would burn slowly through the night. The fire needed to last until morning without consuming too much fuel or burning too hot, which could pose a fire risk. Braziers in rooms without fireplaces were checked. Coals were added if needed. The brazier's position was confirmed, far enough from fabrics and wooden furniture to be safe, close enough to provide some warmth to the bed. Candles and oil lamps were extinguished in most areas. Only a few lights remained, enough for a servant to see by if they needed to tend a fire or respond to a call. Extinguishing lights conserved expensive candles and oil, and it reduced fire risk. Darkness settled over the castle quickly once the lights went out. Tapestries were checked. If any had come loose during the day, they were rehung. Tapestries that had been pulled aside to access something behind them were repositioned to cover the walls properly. This ensured maximum insulation through the night. Windows were covered. Shutters that had been opened during the day to admit light were now closed. Fabric coverings over windows were adjusted to block drafts. Any gaps where cold air was seeping in were stuffed with rags or straw. Doors within the castle were closed. Keeping doors shut between rooms helped contain what little warmth existed in chambers with fires. Open doors allowed cold drafts to flow through the castle, carrying away heat. Chamber pots were placed near beds. These were ceramic or metal containers used for urination during the night. Getting out of a warm bed to use a privy in another part of the castle was unpleasant and dangerous in the dark. Chamber pots allowed people to relieve themselves without leaving the room. Beds were prepared. Servants pulled back the covers, checked that sheets were smooth, and arranged pillows or bolsters. If the bedding had been disturbed during the day, it was straightened. Bed curtains were checked to ensure they would close properly. In the Lord's chamber, a servant filled a pitcher with water or wine and placed it near the bed. If the lord or lady woke thirsty during the night, they could drink without calling for assistance. The pitcher was often placed in a basin near the hearth, where it might stay liquid rather than freezing. Clothing for the next day was laid out. This was done in the evening, so that in the morning cold hands would not have to search through chests or closets. The clothing was placed near the fire if possible, so it would be slightly warmer when put on. Personal items were secured. Jewellery, coins, important documents, anything valuable was stored properly. The castle was relatively secure, but theft was not unknown. Personal items were kept in locked chests or hidden away. Prayers were common before bed. Many households said prayers together, asking for protection through the night and expressing gratitude for the day. This practice served both religious and social functions. It gathered the household together one last time before sleep and reinforced shared beliefs and values. Children were settled. They were taken to chamber pots if needed. They were checked for warmth. Did they have enough layers? Were their caps on properly? They were tucked into bed, kissed, reassured. Children who were frightened of the dark or the cold were comforted until they calmed. The lord or lady went to bed last after ensuring that the household was settled. They moved through the castle, checking on fires, speaking briefly with servants, confirming that all was in order. This was part of their responsibility. The household depended on their oversight. Once in their chamber, the lord or lady undressed minimally. Outer garments might be removed and hung on a peg or laid across a chest. Shoes came off, but most clothing stayed on. The lord or lady climbed into bed, wearing tunics, undergarments, caps, and often a cloak. The bed curtains were drawn. This was the final act of preparation. Once the curtains were closed, the bed became a sealed environment. The person inside was now committed to staying there until morning unless necessity forced them out. Drawing the curtains was done carefully. Each panel had to overlap properly to prevent gaps. Cold air would seep through any opening, undermining the warmth inside. The curtains were heavy and awkward to manage, but they had to be arranged correctly. Inside the curtained bed, the sleeper arranged blankets and furs. These were pulled up to the chin or higher, covering as much of the body as possible. Some people pulled the covers over their heads, leaving only a small opening for breathing. This trapped more warmth, but made breathing slightly more difficult. The sleeper lay still. Movement generated air currents inside the bed curtains, which carried away warmth. Stillness allowed heat to accumulate. The body temperature gradually warmed the air inside the curtains, and the bedding absorbed that warmth. The initial minutes were uncomfortable. Everything was cold, the sheets, the blankets, the air inside the curtains. The sleeper shivered, a reflexive response that generated heat. Gradually, the shivering subsided as warmth accumulated. Sleep came slowly. The body needed to reach a temperature where it could relax enough to sleep. This took time, sometimes a long time. The person lay in the dark, breathing slowly, waiting for warmth, waiting for sleep. Outside the bed, the chamber grew colder. The fire burned low. The tapestries hung still. The castle settled into its winter night silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of a fire, the distant sound of wind, the quiet footsteps of a servant tending coals. This ritual repeated every night. The same actions, the same order, the same goal. Prepare the space, prepare the bed, prepare the body, create the conditions where sleep could occur despite the cold. And then surrender to it, trusting that the preparations would be enough to carry them through until morning. While the household slept, servants remained awake. Not all servants, not all the time, but always some servants, watching, waiting, ready to respond. Their sleep was fragmented, their duties ongoing even through the night. In noble chambers, a personal servant slept on a pallet near the door. This servant was responsible for the fire. Every few hours, they woke and checked the fireplace. If the fire was burning too low, they added wood. If coals needed stirring, they used an iron poker to break up ash and expose the hottest parts. This work required the servant to leave their pallet, cross the cold chamber, kneel at the hearth, and work with the fire. Their hands grew cold. Their face alternated between the warmth of the fire and the cold of the room. They worked quickly, but thoroughness mattered more than speed. A poorly tended fire could go out, and relighting it from scratch in the middle of the night was difficult. After tending the fire, the servant returned to their pallet. They pulled their cloak around themselves and tried to sleep again, but they did not sleep deeply. They remained alert for sounds from the bed, a call for water, a request for another blanket, the need for a chamber pot to be emptied. In the great hall, a servant was assigned to watch the central hearth. This person sat or dozed on a bench near the fire, wrapped in a cloak. They woke periodically to check the banked coals. If the coals were going out, they added small pieces of wood, not enough to create flames, but enough to keep the coals alive until morning. This servant also listened for disturbances. If someone in the hall called out in their sleep or woke in distress, the servant responded. If a child cried, the servant checked on them. If someone needed help finding their way to the privy or locating a chamber pot, the servant provided assistance. The kitchen had servants who prepared food for the next day. Bread dough was mixed at night and left to rise until morning. Fires in the kitchen hearth were kept alive for cooking at dawn. These servants worked through the night in shifts, sleeping in short intervals between tasks. Stable. Hands checked on horses during the night. Horses could become tangled in their tethers or develop health problems that required immediate attention. A servant walked through the stables periodically, carrying a lantern, listening for unusual sounds, checking that animals were calm. Guards patrolled the castle walls if the castle was large enough to have a dedicated guard force. These men walked the perimeter, watching for threats. In winter, this duty was particularly unpleasant. The walls were exposed to wind. Snow and ice made footing treacherous, but the patrol continued regardless of weather. Inside the castle, a night watch sometimes existed. A servant or guard made rounds through corridors and chambers, checking that fires had not spread, that no one was in distress, that all was secure. They carried a lantern or candle and moved quietly to avoid waking the household. Servants who tended fires had the most interrupted sleep. Their duty required them to wake multiple times each night. They developed an internal sense of timing, an ability to sleep lightly enough that they woke when needed. Some became skilled at estimating how long a fire would burn before requiring attention. The work was exhausting. Night after night, winter after winter, these servants rose from their pallets, crossed cold rooms, tended fires, and returned to sleep only to wake again a few hours later. Their days were spent performing other duties, so their total sleep time was minimal. This labour was taken for granted. Nobles sleeping in warm beds rarely thought about the servant who made that warmth possible. The servant's work was effective when it went unnoticed. Success meant the household woke to find fires still burning, chambers tolerable, no crisis having occurred. Failure had consequences. A fire that went out meant a cold morning and displeasure from the master. Repeated failures might result in punishment or dismissal. Servants knew this and performed their duties carefully. Some servants slept in the same chamber as their masters, available immediately if called. This meant the servant had no privacy, no real rest. They slept with one ear alert for any sound that might indicate they were needed. Their presence was constant but supposed to be unobtrusive. Other servants slept in separate servant quarters, but within hearing of a bell or call. If summoned, they had to wake, dress quickly if they had undressed, and hurry through cold corridors to respond. The delay was longer than for servants sleeping in the chamber, but the arrangement provided servants with slightly more independence. Female servants who attended noble women slept near their mistresses. They helped with undressing and dressing, with arranging hair, with personal care. At night, they might be called to adjust bedding, fetch water, or simply provide company if the noblewoman could not sleep. Children's nurses slept with the children in their care. They woke when infants cried, fed them, changed them, soothed them back to sleep. Older children who had nightmares or who woke cold and frightened were comforted by the nurse. This duty required the nurse to sacrifice her own sleep for the children's needs. Servants who worked in the kitchen slept near the kitchen. They rose before dawn to begin preparing the morning meal. The fire in the kitchen hearth had to be rebuilt. Bread had to be baked. Water had to be boiled. Porridge had to be cooked. All of this started while the rest of the household still slept. The hierarchy among servants determined who had the least interrupted sleep. Senior servants, those with more authority and less physical labour, slept more soundly. Junior servants, those at the bottom of the hierarchy, bore the burden of night duties. This created a system where the youngest and least experienced servants were the ones whose sleep was most disrupted. They were also the servants doing the most physically demanding work during the day. Their exhaustion was chronic, but it was also expected. Servants understood that this was the nature of service. They had food, shelter, and a place in the household. In return, they provided labour whenever required, day or night. The arrangement was not negotiated. It simply was. Some servants became ill from chronic exhaustion and exposure to cold. They developed coughs that lasted months. They moved slowly, their energy depleted. In severe cases, they died from illnesses exacerbated by their weakened condition. Other servants adapted. Their bodies became accustomed to interrupted sleep and cold exposure. They developed resilience, a capacity to function on less rest than would incapacitate others. They took brief naps during the day when opportunities arose. They learned to sleep efficiently, falling asleep quickly and deeply during the short windows of rest available to them. The relationship between servants and the nobles they served was not purely transactional. In well-run households, there was mutual respect. A good master ensured that servants had adequate food, warm clothing, and reasonable working conditions. Servants, in turn, provided loyal service, but the fundamental inequality remained. Nobles slept in curtained beds under fur coverlets. Servants slept on straw pallets with thin blankets. Nobles woke when they chose. Servants woke when duty required. The cold night was endured by everyone, but it was not endured equally. And so the servants moved through the castle in the darkness, tending fires, responding to calls, watching over the sleeping household. They were present but invisible, essential but unacknowledged. Their work made the night survivable for others at the cost of their own comfort and rest. Winter nights stretched far beyond what modern people experience. Darkness came early. In the depths of winter, the sun set in mid-afternoon. By 4 in the evening, full darkness had arrived. It would not lift until 8 or 9 the next morning. 16 hours. Darkness. 16 hours when the castle existed by firelight and candlelight alone. This shaped how people experienced the night. The household went to bed earlier in winter than in summer. There was little point in staying awake when darkness made most work impossible. Candles and oil were expensive, burning them for hours each night throughout the winter was wasteful. So as darkness fell, people prepared for sleep. But going to bed at 5 or 6 in the evening meant waking long before dawn. Sleep did not last 16 hours. The body required rest, but not that much rest. Most people slept 7 to 9 hours. This left many hours of darkness to account for. The pattern of sleep was different from modern continuous sleep. People went to bed after dark and slept for several hours. This was called first sleep. They woke naturally in the middle of the night, often around midnight or 1 in the morning. They remained awake for an hour or two. Then they went back to sleep for second sleep, waking again at dawn. This segmented sleep pattern was normal. It was not considered a sleep disorder or a problem. It was simply how sleep happened in a world without artificial lighting. During the waking period between first and second sleep, people engaged in various activities. Some lay quietly in bed, thinking, praying, or talking softly with a bed partner. The darkness and silence encouraged reflection. People thought about the day past, the day ahead, their lives, their concerns. Others engaged in intimacy. The privacy of the curtained bed and the darkness of the night provided opportunity for sexual activity between married couples. This was one of the few times when privacy was assured, when the household was asleep and interruption was unlikely. Some people rose from bed during this waking period. They used chamber pots. They drank water or wine from a pitcher left nearby. They checked on children sleeping in the same room. They adjusted their clothing or bedding if something was uncomfortable. A few people got out of bed and moved about. They might add wood to a fire if they had a fireplace and felt confident doing so without calling a servant. They might stand by the fire for a few minutes, warming themselves before returning to bed. They might open the bed curtains briefly to see if dawn was approaching, though in the middle of the winter, it never was. Servants who were awake tending fires sometimes moved through the castle during these hours. They carried candles or small lamps. Their footsteps echoed in empty corridors. Occasionally, they encountered a noble who had risen from bed temporarily. Brief exchanges occurred. A few words about the cold, about the fire, about nothing in particular. Some people used the waking period to pray. Religious devotion was important to many medieval people. Waking in the middle of the night provided an opportunity for private prayer, for contemplation of spiritual matters. Monks and nuns in religious houses had formal night prayers at specific hours, and some devout lay people adopted similar practices. Others simply lay in the dark and waited for sleep to return. The bed was warm now. The curtains were closed. The darkness was complete. There was nothing to see, nothing to do except wait. The mind wandered. Thoughts drifted. Eventually sleep came again. Second sleep lasted until morning. People woke when they woke, or when servants opened the curtains to begin the day's duties. There were no clocks in most bedchambers. Time was judged by feeling, by the sense that enough sleep had occurred, by the faint lightening of darkness that indicated dawn approaching. The quality of sleep during these long winter nights was not always good. The cold intruded. Even in a curtained bed with many blankets, some cold penetrated. People woke because they were uncomfortable, because their feet were cold, because they needed to shift position. Dreams were vivid during winter nights. The long hours of darkness, the cold, the isolation, all contributed to a tense dreaming. People woke from dreams and lay in the dark trying to interpret their meaning. Dreams were thought to carry messages, warnings, insights. A disturbing dream was discussed in the morning, analysed, taken seriously. Nightmares occurred. The darkness, the cold, the vulnerability of sleep, these created conditions where fear manifested in dreams. People woke gasping, frightened, disoriented. In a shared bed, a partner might provide comfort. Alone, the fear had to be endured until it passed. Children struggled with the long darkness. They woke frightened, calling for parents or nurses. They needed reassurance that morning would come, that they were safe. Children sleeping with adults pressed against them, seeking comfort and warmth. The elderly sometimes found the long nights difficult. Their bodies ached from lying in one position for extended periods. They woke more frequently than younger adults. They lay awake longer between first and second sleep. The cold affected them more severely. Some elderly people dreaded winter nights. Illness was worse at night. A person with a cough or fever suffered more into the darkness. The cold exacerbated symptoms. There was little that could be done except endure. Medicine was limited. Comfort measures consisted of extra blankets, warm drinks, and the presence of someone caring for the sick person. People who were dying often died at night. The cold, the darkness, the low point of the body's rhythms, all contributed to death coming in the early morning hours. Families keeping vigil over a dying loved one sat through long winter nights, waiting, watching, praying. The castle itself seemed different at night. Sounds carried strangely through empty corridors. Stone walls absorbed and reflected sounds in unexpected ways. A footstep in a distant hallway echoed as though it were nearby. Wind and outside created noises inside, whistling through gaps, pressing against shutters, making tapestries shift. Some people feared the night. Darkness held unknowns. Stories of spirits, of dangers lurking in shadows were common. These stories gained power in the long winter darkness. People drew their bed curtains not just for warmth, but for psychological protection, creating a barrier between themselves and the dark room beyond. Others found the night peaceful. The absence of activity, the silence, the enforced stillness, these provided respite from the demands of the day. The long darkness was a time when nothing was expected, when no one made demands, when rest was the only requirement. Time moved differently in winter darkness. Hours felt longer. The wait for dawn stretched endlessly. People lay in their beds, warm but confined, comfortable but isolated, resting but aware. The night persisted, unchanging, until finally, gradually, imperceptibly, the first hints of grey light appeared at the windows and the long darkness began to lift. Morning revealed what the night had created. When servants opened shutters or drew back bed curtains, they saw frost. Thin white crystals covered surfaces throughout the castle. Window glass, where it existed, was opaque with ice patterns. Tapestries near exterior walls bore a light coating of frozen moisture. Metal surfaces, door handles, fireplace tools, armour on display, were cold enough to burn bare skin. Frost formed because warm, moist air from breathing, from fears, from the presence of people came into contact with surfaces that were below freezing. The moisture condensed and froze instantly. Over the course of a long winter night, the accumulation became visible. Inside bed curtains, the fabric was damp. Breath had added moisture to the enclosed air all night. The curtains absorbed some of it. The sections of curtain closest to the cold chamber walls were coldest, and there the moisture had frozen. Opening the curtains in the morning meant pulling back fabric that was stiff with ice along its edges. The sleeper's breath was visible in the chamber air. Each exhalation produced a cloud that hung briefly before dispersing. This continued all morning until fires had warmed the chamber enough that breath no longer condensed. In some rooms, that point was never reached during winter days. Water left in pitchers overnight often froze. A pitcher placed near the hearth might remain liquid, benefiting from the fire's residual warmth. But a pitcher on a table away from the fire would be solid ice by morning. The ice had to be broken or the pitcher moved near the fire to thaw before the water could be used. Wine was less likely to freeze than water because alcohol lowers the freezing point. But in the coldest chambers, even wine developed ice crystals. Thick, rich wines fared better than thin wines. Still, drinking from a pitcher in the morning meant dealing with a liquid that was barely above freezing and comfortable going down. Floors were particularly cold in the morning. Stone floors had absorbed cold all night and now radiated it upward. Placing bare feet on the floor was painful. Most people kept some form of footwear beside the bed specifically for this purpose. Soft leather shoes, thick wool socks, wooden clogs, anything to create a barrier between ticking and stone. Getting out of bed required courage. Inside the curtains, warmth had accumulated. The body was comfortable under layers of blankets and furs. But the chamber outside the curtains was frigid. The air felt sharp when the curtains were first opened. The temperature difference was dramatic. The process of leaving the bed was done quickly. Curtains opened, body moved to the edge of the bed, feet lowered to the floor, person stood and immediately reached for a cloak. The goal was to minimize exposure to the cold air while transitioning from the warm bed to being dressed and moving. Servants who had tended fires through the night had already been up for hours. They had faced the morning cold earlier, when it was darkest and coldest. By the time the household woke, servants had rekindled fires, brought water, prepared chambers as much as possible. But even with these preparations, the cold remained. Morning routines involved standing near fires. People dressed close to the hearth, taking advantage of what warmth it provided. Clothing that had been laid out the night before near the fire was now slightly warm, which made putting it on more bearable. Cold fabric against skin was unpleasant. Warm fabric was a small mercy. Washing in winter was minimal. Water for washing had to be heated, which required time and fuel. Most people splashed their faces with water from a basin, but the water was cold and the experience was bracing rather than refreshing. Hands were washed before meals, but full body washing was rare in winter. Hair was combed or brushed, but not washed. Women's long hair was braided or pinned up, then covered with wimples or veils. Men's hair was shorter and required less maintenance. The cold made hair stiff, especially if someone had gone outside where moisture in the hair had frozen. Frost on interior walls was wiped away in important rooms. Servants used cloths to remove the moisture before it could drip down and damage tapestries or furnishings. This was a daily task in winter. The frost returned every night and had to be addressed every morning. In the great hall, the scene each morning was similar. People rose from their sleeping places on benches and floors. They wrapped cloaks around themselves. They moved toward the central hearth, where servants had rebuilt the fire. The hall filled with people seeking warmth, their breath visible, their movements stiff from cold and from sleeping on hard surfaces. Children woke cold and unhappy. They cried or complained. They needed to be comforted, dressed and fed. Getting children ready in the morning took longer in winter because the cold made them resistant to leaving their beds and resistant to the discomfort of the morning routine. Breakfast was the first priority. Hot food provided internal warmth that made the morning more tolerable. Porridge, bread, ale, these were consumed quickly, not for pleasure, but for the warmth and energy they provided. The kitchen had been active for hours, and hot food was ready when the household woke. The morning light, when it finally came, was weak. Winter sun provided illumination but little warmth. The angle of the sun was low. Light entered through windows at a slant, creating long shadows. The light itself seemed cold, grey rather than golden. Outside, frost covered everything. Grass was white, trees were coated, the ground was hard, the world looked brittle and still. This external frost reminded everyone that the cold inside the castle was mild compared to the cold outside. The walls, as cold as they were, still provided protection from the harsher reality beyond them. Morning sounds filled the castle, doors opening and closing, footsteps on the stone, voices calling to each other, the crackle of fires, the clatter of kitchen work, life resuming after the long night. The sounds themselves seemed sharper in the cold air, carrying farther, echoing longer. The transition from night to day was not a sudden shift from cold to warmth. The castle remained cold all day, but there was activity, light, purpose. These psychological elements made the cold more bearable. The night's isolation and stillness ended. The household functioned, work resumed, And so each morning began the same way. Frost, breath in the air, reluctant exits from warm beds, quick movements to fires. The gradual return to daily routines. The evidence of the cold night was everywhere, but it was addressed, managed, incorporated into the rhythm of life. Another day started. Another night would eventually follow. Medieval people were cold in winter, but not as cold as modern people would be. Their bodies had adapted, not through genetic evolution, that takes far longer than a few generations, but through developmental adaptation during childhood and continued exposure throughout life. Children born into cold environments experienced cold from infancy. Their bodies learned to maintain core temperature with less external heat. Blood vessels near the skin became more responsive, constricting quickly to preserve core warmth and dilating when safe to do so. The body's thermoregulatory system calibrated itself to an environment where cold was constant. This adaptation was not conscious. The body simply developed in response to its environment. A child who spent winters in a cold castle learned to function in that cold. Their comfort threshold was different from a child raised in a consistently warm environment. Adults who had lived their entire lives in these conditions had bodies that responded to cold differently than modern adults would. Their metabolism adjusted. They generated slightly more heat at rest. Their shivering response was more efficient. Their tolerance for cold hands and feet was higher because they experienced these sensations constantly. This did not mean they were comfortable. They still felt cold, they still sought warmth, but the level of cold that would incapacitate a modern person was merely unpleasant for them. They could function, work, sleep in conditions that would seem intolerable today. Brown fat played a role. This is a type of fat tissue that generates heat. Infants have more brown fat than adults, which helps them maintain body temperature despite their small size and large surface area. In cold environments, humans retain more brown fat into adulthood. Medieval people living in cold castles likely had more active brown fat than modern people living in heated homes. Clothing worn constantly also affected adaptation. Bodies that were always insulated by layers of wool developed differently than bodies regularly exposed to temperature variations. The skin, the blood vessels, the mechanisms of heat production and conservation, all calibrated to the reality of constant layers and constant cold. Diet contributed as well. Medieval diets were high in calories during winter, when available. Fats, grains, preserved meats, these provided fuel for the body's heat generation. People ate more in winter, and their bodies used those calories to maintain temperature. The connection between food and warmth was understood practically, if not scientifically. Activity levels helped. Medieval life involved constant physical labor for most people. Work generated body heat. Even the wealthy moved more than modern sedentary people. Walking through cold corridors, climbing stairs, hunting, managing estates, all created internal heat. The body stayed warmer through activity, but there were limits to adaptation. The very young and the very old struggled. Infants could not maintain body heat effectively. They relied on being kept close to adult bodies, on being wrapped in layers, on environments that adults worked to keep as warm as possible. Infant mortality increased in winter partly because cold was an additional stressor on vulnerable systems. The elderly lost their ability to generate and conserve heat efficiently. Their circulation decreased, their metabolism slowed, they felt cold more intensely, and recovered from cold exposure more slowly. Winter was dangerous for elderly people. Many died during the coldest months. Illness reduced cold tolerance. A person with a fever, cough, or infection had less energy to spare for maintaining body temperature. Cold worsened their condition. The cycle of cold leading to illness and illness-reducing cold tolerance was well understood, even if the mechanisms were not. Malnutrition had similar effects. A person without adequate food could not generate sufficient body heat. Servants and poor people who had less food in winter were colder as a result. Their bodies burned whatever fuel was available, but when fuel was insufficient, body temperature dropped. Chronic exposure to cold had long-term effects. Joint pain was common, especially in older adults. Cold, damp conditions exacerbated arthritis and similar conditions. People who had worked in cold environments their entire lives often developed chronic pain that worsened in winter. Frostbite occurred, though it was less common inside castles than outside, Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were vulnerable. Exposure to extreme cold for extended periods could damage tissue. Servants who worked outside or who tended animals in open areas were at risk. Treatment was limited. Damaged tissue sometimes healed, sometimes became infected, sometimes was lost entirely. Chilblains were more common. These are painful inflammations of small blood vessels in the skin, caused by repeated exposure to cold followed by rapid warming. Hands and feet that were cold for hours, then warmed quickly by a fire, developed chilblains. The affected areas itched intensely and could become ulcerated. Nearly everyone in a medieval castle had experienced chilblains at some point. Despite these challenges, people survived. They lived full lives, raised families, sung years, worked, celebrated, endured. The cold was a constant factor, but it was not the only factor. Life continued through winter. The adaptation was psychological as well as physical. Medieval people did not expect to be warm. They expected to be cold in winter. This expectation shaped their experience. Discomfort that would be considered intolerable by someone expecting warmth was simply normal for someone expecting cold. Complaining about the cold was less common than one might think. Complaints implied that things should be different, that warmth was a reasonable expectation. But if cold was simply the nature of winter, what was there to complain about? People endured rather than protested. This stoicism was cultural as well as practical. Endurance of hardship was valued. Suffering without complaint was a virtue. Winter cold was one form of hardship, and facing it without excessive protest was expected behaviour. Children learned these attitudes from adults. They learned to tolerate cold, to function despite it, to accept it as normal. By the time they were adults, their bodies and minds had both adapted to an environment that modern people would find extreme. The adaptation was not complete. People still died from cold-related causes. Hypothermia occurred when someone was exposed to extreme cold for too long. Usually this happened to travellers caught in storms, but it could happen inside a castle if someone was elderly, ill, or inadequately clothed. But most people survived most winters. Their bodies kept them alive through the cold months. They woke each morning, they performed their duties. They went to sleep each night. The cold shaped their experience, but it did not define their entire existence. They were medieval people living medieval lives, and the cold was simply part of that reality, not every part of the castle was used equally throughout the year. As winter approached, households made strategic decisions about which rooms to occupy and which to abandon to the cold. This practice was called seasonal movement, and it was a practical response to the impossibility of heating large structures. The largest rooms were hardest to heat. The Great Hall, with its high ceiling and vast floor space, was the centre of activity during warmer months, but in deep winter some households reduced their use of the hall. Meals might be taken there, but afterward, people moved to smaller rooms where warmth could be concentrated. Private chambers that were used year-round in larger households might be abandoned in smaller ones. A noble family might have a summer chamber in one part of the castle and a winter chamber in another. The winter chamber was smaller, easier to heat, located in a more protected part of the structure. The selection of a winter chamber considered several factors. Proximity to other occupied rooms helped, because those rooms generated some ambient heat. Distance from exterior walls was beneficial. Lower floors were often warmer than upper floors because heat from ground level and from any spaces below provided some insulation. Chambers near kitchens were warmer. The kitchen fires burned all day and generated significant heat. Some households positioned winter sleeping quarters adjacent to or above kitchens, specifically to take advantage of this heat source. In castles with animals kept indoors during winter, the presence of livestock provided warmth. Horses, cattle, pigs, these animals generated body heat. Keeping them in ground floor or basement areas meant that heat rose to human living spaces above. The smell was unpleasant, but the warmth benefit was real. Some castles had ground floor storage areas that were partially underground. These undercrofts stayed warmer in winter than rooms fully above ground because the earth itself provided insulation. The temperature underground fluctuates less than above ground. Living above an undercroft meant benefiting from that thermal stability. When a chamber was abandoned for winter, its contents were often moved. Valuable items were relocated to occupied rooms for security. Furniture might be moved or covered, tapestries might be taken down and stored, or they might be left to provide some protection to the room's contents. Abandoned rooms grew very cold. Water left in them froze solid. The frost on walls was thick. When spring came and these rooms were reopened, they had to be aired out, cleaned, checked for damage from freezing and moisture. The movement to winter quarters was a household event. Servants moved belongings, rearranged furniture, ensured that the winter chambers were properly set up. This happened gradually as autumn progressed, with the final transition completed before the coldest weather arrived. Not all households had the space or resources for seasonal movement. Smaller castles or households with limited means stayed in the same chambers year-round and simply endured the winter cold. They added extra layers to windows, hung more tapestries, piled more bedding on beds, but they did not relocate. Royal households and the very wealthy sometimes moved between different residences entirely. They might spend winter in a more compact, defensible castle and summer in a larger, more comfortable one. This was less about comfort than about practicality and tradition, but it had the effect of moving the household to spaces that were easier to keep warm. Hunting lodges and rural estates were typically abandoned in winter. These structures were smaller and even harder to heat than major castles. The household consolidated in Ramshall in the primary residence, leaving smaller properties unoccupied until spring. The strategy of concentrating people into fewer rooms had social implications. More people sharing fewer spaces meant less privacy, more interaction, more potential for conflict, but also more shared warmth. Communal living intensified in winter. Fires were maintained only in occupied rooms. This conserved fuel and labour. There was no point in heating empty chambers. The castle became a landscape of warm spots separated by cold zones. Moving between occupied rooms meant passing through freezing corridors and halls. Some castles used portable partitions to divide large rooms into smaller spaces. Wooden screens or heavy fabric hangings could section off part of a great hall, creating a more contained area that was easier to keep warm. These partitions were temporary, erected in autumn, and removed in spring. The practice of seasonal movement also applied to bed locations. In summer, a bed might be positioned near a window to take advantage of cooling breezes. In winter, the same bed was moved away from windows, placed against an interior wall, where it was more protected from drafts. Bed curtains became more important in winter. In summer, they might be pulled back or even removed for better air circulation. In winter, they were kept closed as much as possible. The enclosure they created was essential for sleeping warmth. Layer strategies extended to room furnishings. In winter, additional rugs were placed on floors, more cushions were added to chairs and benches, extra tapestries were hung. Every surface that could be covered with fabric was covered, creating more insulation between people and cold stone. These adaptations required planning and effort. A well-managed household anticipated winter and prepared accordingly. A poorly managed household struggled, making changes reactively as problems arose rather than proactively before winter's full severity hit. The effectiveness of seasonal movement strategies varied. A household that had optimized its approach over generations knew exactly which rooms to use, how to arrange them, what worked, and what did not. Newer households or households in newer castles learned through trial and error. Weather varied from year to year. Some winters were milder, others more severe. Strategies that worked in a mild winter might be insufficient in a harsh one. Households had to be flexible, prepared to make additional adjustments if a particular winter proved exceptionally cold. Spring brought the reversal of the process. As weather warmed, abandoned rooms were reopened. Contents were moved back. Bed curtains were pulled aside more often. The castle expanded back into its full volume. Summer arrangements replaced winter ones, and the household spread out again into the spaces that had been too cold to occupy comfortably for months. This cycle repeated every year. It was an accepted rhythm of castle life. The building itself dictated how it could be used, and the seasons dictated which parts were habitable. People adapted their behaviour to fit these realities. They moved, adjusted, concentrated, and spread out again as the year progressed. Survival in winter required flexibility, planning, and the willingness to abandon comfort for practicality. There was no escape from winter cold in a medieval castle. This was understood. It was not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be endured. The cold would come, it would last for months, then it would pass. This cycle repeated every year, and it would continue regardless of what anyone did. Acceptance began early. Children born in castles learned from infancy that winter meant cold. They experienced it before they could understand it. By the time they could think about their environment, the cold was already normal. It was not an aberration or a failure of their household. It was simply winter. Adults who had lived through many winters knew exactly what to expect. The first cold nights of autumn signalled the beginning. The pattern of progressively colder days, the first frost, the first snow, these marked the transition into the endurance period. There was no surprise. It had happened before. It would happen again. Endurance required mental as well as physical strength. Knowing that the cold would last months was psychologically challenging. The wait for spring began in December and stretched through January, February into March. In northern regions, cold persisted into April. The duration tested patience and resolve. People developed mental frameworks that helped. They marked time by religious festivals. Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, Lent. These provided waypoints through the winter. Each festival was a milestone, a sign that time was passing, that spring was gradually approaching. Work continued through winter. Necessary tasks did not stop because of cold. Animals needed care, food needed preparation, the castle needed maintenance. Work provided distraction and purpose. It gave structure to days that otherwise might have felt interminable. Social connections became more important in winter. People spent more time together in heated rooms. They talked, told stories, played games, shared experiences. The long dark evenings required entertainment, and that entertainment was communal. Isolation would have been psychologically damaging. Community provided support. Religious faith offered comfort, prayer. Religious observances, belief in divine purpose. These helped people make sense of their suffering. The cold was part of God's world. Enduring it was part of their duty. Spring would come because God ordained it. This framework provided meaning and hope, but acceptance did not mean absence of suffering. People suffered. They were cold, uncomfortable, sometimes in pain. They woke stiff and aching, they endured chilblains, chapped skin, chronic coughs. The suffering was real. Complaints were allowed within limits. People could acknowledge that they were cold, that the winter was difficult, that they looked forward to spring. These were acceptable expressions of shared experience. What was not acceptable was excessive complaint, self-pity, or demands that things be different than they were. The wealthy suffered less than the poor, but they still suffered. Their beds were warmer, their chambers better heated, their clothing heavier and of better quality, but they still felt cold, they still endured winter. The difference was degree, not kind. Death was more common in winter. The elderly, the very young, the ill, these populations were vulnerable. Families lost members in winter. This was expected and mourned, but not considered abnormal. Winter was a time of death as well as endurance. The grief was real, but it was incorporated into the acceptance of winter's nature. Spring's arrival was celebrated. The first warm day, the first green shoots, the first bird song, these were noticed and valued. Winter's end was not taken for granted. People emerged from winter grateful to have survived, ready to engage with a warmer, brighter world. The memory of winter faded during summer. By autumn, people remembered that winter had been difficult, but perhaps forgot the precise degree of discomfort. This partial forgetting was adaptive. If people remembered too vividly, they might dread winter more than they could bear. Some forgetting allowed them to face the next winter with equanimity. Each winter was slightly different. One might be colder, another wetter, another windier. But the core experience remained constant. Cold stone, insufficient heat, long dark nights, the wait for spring. These elements defined every medieval winter. The castle itself endured alongside its inhabitants. The stone weathered. Ice expanded in cracks, causing slow structural damage that would accumulate over decades. But the walls stood. The building survived to house another generation through another series of winters. Medieval people did not think of their experience as exceptional. They did not know that future generations would live in heated buildings, would have access to technologies that made winter mild. They thought of their experience as simply human experience. This is how people lived. This is what winter required. This is what they did. Their endurance was not heroic in their own eyes. It was ordinary. They slept in cold beds, woke to frost on walls, worked through cold days, and slept again through cold nights. They did this for months, every year, for their entire lives. And when they died, others took their places. New children were born into the cold castle. New generations learned to endure. The knowledge passed down. How to layer clothing, how to bank a fire, how to create warmth in a curtained bed, how to wait for spring. The cycle continued for centuries. Stone castles stood cold through countless winters. Countless people slept in them, survived in them, lived their lives in them. The cold was always there. So was the endurance.